I am super excited to get to introduce my longtime friend, Jud Brewer. Um, Judd is Princeton class of 96. He's a former OA leader, Heart Wilderness First Aid instructor, and leader trainer. And after graduating from Princeton, Judd went on to an MD PhD program and has really focused as a psychiatrist on mindfulness. So I'll just read, I mean, there are sort of volumes of things written about Judd and the work that he's done in sort of mindfulness and health and wellness. But he's really considered a thought leader in habit change and the science of self-mastery, having combined over 20 years of experience with mindfulness training with his scientific research. He's currently the Director of Research and Innovation at the Mindfulness Center and the Associate Professor of Behavioral and Social Sciences and Psychiatry at the School of Public Health and Medicine at Brown University. Judd has been doing mindfulness-related work for many years related to addiction and a variety of health-related things. He's trained Olympic athletes, coaches, foreign government ministers, and his work's been featured on 60 Minutes, TED, the New York Times, Time Magazine, Forbes, the BBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, Business Week, and others. He founded a company called Mind Sciences to take a lot of the research work that he had done and build it into apps that people can use so that folks can actually work on this in their daily lives. So it isn't just something where you need to necessarily go to a professional psychotherapist. A lot of these activities are things that you can delve into on your own. So that is plenty. Judd is a wonderful speaker and a great friend. So Judd, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rick. It's really great to be here. I have to say, my first job at Princeton was working for Rick the summer after my freshman year. I was so enthralled with the OA program. It really changed my life that I just wanted to do whatever I could to stay close to it. So I was a frost trip coordinator the summer after my freshman year and basically led OA trips like every break that we had because it was such a life-changing experience for me. So I just want to say I'm so grateful to Rick and the OA program. It literally was a life changer for me. And I have to say, even just speaking from a personal perspective, maybe that's the way to start this, is that I didn't realize until after I graduated from Princeton how much I was actually learning about my own mind and about a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about tonight in terms of mindfulness from going on backpacking trips and other types of wilderness trips through OA. It was only in retrospect that I saw a lot of this and had actually learned some fundamental concepts through my leader training and through OA and just through self-discovery in being on these trips that actually was very formative for a lot of the research that I do, and also even plays a role in how I treat my patients to this day in my clinic. So, I will maybe even I'll start. I'm not sure that Rick knows this story, but my senior year at Princeton, I was actually pretty stressed out about medical school and a bunch of other things. And I had what turned out to be irritable bowel syndrome. And I actually went to student health. And I told the doc there, I said, I think it's Giardia because I must not have threaded my water bottles well enough or something. And the doc looks at me and he says, are you sure you're not just stressed? And I'm like, no, I'm not stressed. I play the violin, I run, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, okay. and sent me on my way. And it was only when I started learning about things like irritable bowel syndrome and things like that in medical school that I realized that there was this strong mind-body connection. When to spend a lot of time in my MD PhD program studying this connection between the mind and body, and then shifted my whole career. I was doing molecular biology research. I shifted my whole career from that into studying mindfulness because I had started meditating my first day of medical school. And I realized that that was actually building on a lot of the self-awareness that I had learned in the woods. And so, I'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But I don't want this to be some intellectual lecture where I try to impart some knowledge, but really to keep this personal. And so I thought this would be. I talked to Rick about this, and we thought that talking about anxiety right now and why anxiety is really skyrocketing might hit home for a lot of folks. If you're not anxious, you probably know somebody that is. So I will share my screen. I'll talk for about 20 minutes, and then really we wanted to leave as much time as possible for a discussion. So I've set it up to keep the slide part minimum. But I'll share my screen now, and we will get started. Okay, so I thought we'd think about this in terms of mindfulness in the time of COVID, working with anxiety and uncertainty. And I think one way to start this is just with a story of a patient that I've been seeing in my clinic. So there was a gentleman that was referred to me, who was about 40 years of age. This was a little over a year ago. And I was just told the chief complaint of anxiety. And he walked in my office door, and I could tell he was pretty anxious. I started getting his history and asked him, what his story was. And he described how when he would be driving on the highway, which is why I'm showing a picture here depicting this, when he was on the highway, he would have these thoughts come up in his head where he literally said, he felt like he was in a speeding bullet. Those were his words. I'm in a speeding bullet. And he started worrying that he would get in an accident and hurt somebody. And those worries became so strong that he started avoiding driving on the highway, and then started even barely driving on city streets before he would get, severely anxious. He was also very overweight. He was about 180 pounds overweight, had hypertension, had a fatty liver, had obstructive sleep apnea, a bunch of things related to his obesity. So, in medical school, what did we learn in terms of treating somebody with anxiety or treating somebody with obesity? Well, in fact, we haven't actually learned a whole lot about how to treat anxiety. There's some medications that sometimes can be helpful for some people, but for the vast majority of the population, medication isn't the silver bullet. And what I did learn, was these willpower-based approaches. So, for example, when it comes to weight loss, it's about just making sure that you eat salad instead of cake when somebody is obese and trying to lose weight. But or when my patients were struggling with quitting smoking or cocaine or heroin or whatever, it was a lot of just try to tough out those cravings. Now, I could actually relate to these folks because when I started meditating myself, I was using that willpower-based approach. I was trying to, grit through it. And I remember I went on a silent week-long meditation retreat in medical school. And about day 3, the instruction was very simple. Pay attention to your breath. When your mind wanders, bring it back to your breath. So the instruction's simple, but I found by day 3, I was crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager because here, I could get through Princeton, I could get into medical school, I could do fine in medical school, but I couldn't pay attention to my breath. So I was missing something. I was, my patients were missing something in terms of, me trying to help them overcome their addictions. What were we all missing? So, here's a guy affiliated with Princeton. He is reported to have said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I like this quote because this really highlights something that many of us had been missing, including myself, which was, there's this part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's the youngest and the weakest part of the brain from an evolutionary perspective. And that's the part of the brain that's involved in cognitive control, in willpower. Yet, what I would suggest is that we, whether it was me learning in my residency training or trying to meditate or folks trying to quit smoking, we didn't really know how our minds worked. And so that's what I would suggest is actually the starting point for where to actually work with learning how our minds work and even changing behaviors and critically working with things like anxiety. So what I thought we could do is start with kind of how anxiety gets set up and how it kind of taps into our basic survival mechanism. So I'm going to show you a short animation that describes this.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself. Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists raced to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us, and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits. But this is only the first step. To hack our brains and break the anxiety cycle, we need to become aware of two things. One, that we are getting anxious or panicking, and two, what the result is. This helps us see if our behavior is actually helping us survive, or in fact moving us in the opposite direction. Panic can lead to impulsive behaviors that are dangerous, and anxiety has near and long-term consequences both mentally and physically. Once we are aware of how unrewarding anxiety is, we can then deliberately bring in the bigger, better offer. Since our brains will choose more rewarding behaviors simply because they feel better, we can practice replacing old habitual behaviors such as worry with those that are naturally more rewarding. These are the bigger, better offers. For example, if we notice that we have a habit of touching our face, we can be on the lookout for when we act out that behavior. At that moment, we can step back and notice if we're starting to worry. Oh no, I touched my face. Maybe I'll catch something. And instead of panicking, we can take a deep breath and ask ourselves, when was the last time I cleaned my hands? Just by taking a moment to pause and ask the question, we give our prefrontal cortex a chance to come back online and do what it does best. Think. Oh right, I just washed my hands. Here we can leverage certainty. If we've just washed our hands and haven't been out in public, the likelihood that we're going to get sick is pretty low. The more we can see the positive feeling and effects of good hygiene and compare them to the negative feeling of uncertainty or getting caught up in anxiety, the more our brains naturally move toward the former. Because it feels better, they naturally choose the bigger, better offer. How do I know this? My lab has studied these mechanisms for decades. We've recently found that simple mindfulness training, delivered through an app called Unwinding Anxiety, can reduce anxiety by 57% in a study that we did with anxious physicians. In a second study with people with generalized anxiety disorder, we saw that anxiety went down by 63% in just a couple of months. Understanding these simple learning mechanisms will help all of us keep calm and carry on, which is how London dealt with the uncertainty of constant air raids in World War II. As we keep calm and carry on, this helps us keep from getting caught in anxiety or panic whenever we face uncertainty. When our prefrontal cortex comes back online, we can compare anxiety to what it feels like to be calm. To our brains, it's a no-brainer. It simply takes a little practice so that the bigger, better offer becomes our new habit.
Okay. So
Anxiety.
just to sum that up and actually highlight where this learning process comes from, this actually comes from our survival brains trying to help us remember where food is. Which actually has just 3 elements that lead to behavior. So if you remember nothing else from this evening, just remember that a trigger behavior result actually will drive virtually any habit that we form. And in fact, this guy, some of you might recognize him if you've taken any psychology courses or the pigeons give him away. B.F. Skinner was really interested in understanding animal behavior and actually outlined or mapped out this process back in the 50s. In fact, he found that he could get a pigeon to win a cross-court shot in ping pong for a food reward. This is a video from the Skinner archive. You can see there's the winning shot and there's the food reward. Now, I highlight all of this because if we don't understand how our minds work, we can't possibly work with our minds. And this is where a lot of the work that my lab has done comes in. So, we think of, you can even start to explore anxiety itself as a habit loop, which was something that I hadn't realized and hadn't recognized or hadn't learned in residency training. But yet it turns out that even back in the back to the 1980s, folks had been mapping out anxiety as a negatively reinforced habit loop. And I'll show you a very brief video on how this works.
We'll talk more about the neuroscience of our brains in a bit, but for now, let's focus specifically on how habits around anxiety are formed. We'll call it the habit loop. First, something happens in your life. It could be good or bad. It's called a trigger. For example, what does it feel like when something good happens in your life? Let's use getting a funny text or watching a cute video on your phone as an example. Your brain says, "Oh, that feels good. Do that some more," so you can keep that good feeling going. So your brain lays down this memory. Oh, next time you want to feel good, you should do that again. Now you start to associate that behavior with feeling good. The next time you hear that alert on your phone, that triggers your brain to act. Oh, I should check my phone. The more you do this, getting an alert on your phone, leading you to watch a cute video, leading you to feel good, the more this gets laid down as a habit loop. Trigger, behavior, reward. This works with negative emotions too. Have you ever just thought about how far behind you are on your to-do list? Or beaten yourself up for making a mistake or missing a deadline at school or work? How does that feel? Not so good, is it? Just like we want to have more good feelings, we want bad feelings to go away as quickly as possible. So what do we do when this happens? We get triggered by that thought or emotion and go and do something on our phones to feel better. This too lays down a memory. If you're stressed or anxious, distract yourself. You'll feel better. The more we do this, get anxious, which leads to distracting ourselves, which leads to feeling a little bit better, the more this too becomes a habit. Trigger, behavior, reward. Now, do you have stress or anxiety that seems to trigger more anxiety, feeding on itself? This might become its own type of habit loop. For example, you think of all the things you have to do today. Then you start to worry that you can't possibly get everything done. And that stressful thought triggers more worry thoughts. This goes on and on as you tighten down into a tiny ball of anxiety. In this case, stress itself can easily become a trigger for out-of-control anxiety. Instead of stress triggering us to get our to-do list done so we feel better, it triggers out-of-control worry thinking. Getting caught up in worry thinking becomes the new behavior in the habit loop. The result? We contract down into that tight little ball of anxiety. That's not much of a reward, is it? So there can be two types of habit loops that can be happening here. The one in which the behavior of doing something, like distracting ourselves, can make us feel a little bit better, and the one where the behavior is out of control thinking that just gets us all knotted up in a ball of anxiety. No matter which habit loop it is, what's tricky is that the more you get caught up in these behaviors, the more automatic they become. Over time, you're not even consciously choosing these actions anymore. It's like you're on autopilot. You're not even flying the plane.
So the key here is really understanding how these habit loops work and mapping out our minds. And once we start to map out how our minds work, we can start to work with our minds. And this is where a lot of this work that my lab has done with mindfulness training comes in. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the simple definition of mindfulness, you can think of it as, paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. So it really has two characteristics: awareness, so paying attention, but also not getting caught up in judgment of, oh, this is great or this is terrible, but simply bringing a curious attitude to that awareness itself. And that those two sides of the coin come together and bring, forward what we think of conceptually as mindfulness. So how does mindfulness actually work? And that's one of the things that my lab has been studying. And as you saw from that earlier video, we've actually developed some app-based mindfulness training programs where we can give people short, bite-sized training modules every day, help them understand how their minds work, link this to mindfulness. We can then have these daily modules include things like animations, like I just showed you, in the moment exercises. So when somebody's anxious or caught up in an anxiety habit loop, they can step out of it. And importantly, we can embed things like experience sampling so that we can track their progress and efficacy in their daily life. Long story short, we've done a couple of studies. For example, with app-based mindfulness training. We did one with anxious physicians, found that we got a 57% reduction in anxiety over about 3 months. We then did a randomized controlled trial where we could compare the people that got just usual clinical care versus those that got clinical care plus the Unlearning Anxiety app. Here you can see that at 2 months, we got a 63% reduction in anxiety in the active group, which was much greater than about a 15% reduction in anxiety in the control group. So this suggests that, we can actually target these core mechanisms, and targeting these core mechanisms really helps people change their relationship to anxiety and eventually not get caught up in it as much. And what this suggests is that, once we understand how the mind works, we can actually directly target it and help people in a real way. So I just want to end with a couple of minutes of talking about some of the neuroscience here. It turns out that there's a network of brain regions called the default mode network. You can see this here in these two orange blobs. This is called the posterior cingulate cortex. This is the medial prefrontal cortex. And in fact, this was a study published a couple of years ago that showed that worry, as people get more and more worried, this correlates with activation of these two hubs of this default mode network, the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex. Now, this network is interesting because it is what our brains default to, not only when we're anxious, but when we're worrying about the future or when we're regretting things in the past, when our minds start to get caught up in what's described as perseveration. Now, interestingly, my lab has been studying experienced meditators to see what happens in their brains. And about 10 years ago, we did a study with experienced versus novice meditators where we looked at a bunch of different types of meditations. And lo and behold, we found that expert meditators showed decreased activity in this default mode network. You can see blue here means less activity in experienced versus novice meditators. When we looked across the entire brain, we found that only four regions of the brain were deactivated, and 2 of these 4 were this default mode network. Now, we can take this work much farther, and in fact, we can look to see, what happens in real time, so we can link up people's brain activity with their direct subjective experience. And we can do this by having people meditate while we show them activity in specific brain regions like the default mode network. We can also use control regions as a way to make sure that people aren't fooling themselves. And we can see how all of this works. So we were fortunate enough to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out on film for 60 Minutes a couple of years ago. And I'll show you what happened in his brain as he was exploring this.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with contagion gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay. When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay. When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
So just to bring all of this together, in summary, what has been known for a long time, but we haven't actually been tapping into from a therapeutic perspective, is this habit loop. We can have these negative emotions that lead to worrying or stress eating or whatever, which can give us this temporary relief. But in fact, what mindfulness suggests is that we can replace this, replace these behaviors with, what we were saying earlier as, or describing as, this bigger, better offer. And here, I turn to my muse, Liz Carroll, where Alice in Wonderland exclaimed, "Curiouser and curiouser." She's really talking about this attitudinal element of mindfulness. What we would suggest is that mindfulness brings in an internally available and intrinsically rewarding behavior of being curious that we can replace worry with. So we can, when we start to get worried or anxious, we can get curious about what that feels like. We can get curious about our thoughts. We can get curious about our emotions. And that curiosity, because it is always available, might lead to a sustained relief and provide that bigger, better offer. I'll give you an example of somebody who went through our Unwinning Anxiety program, who said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic. And instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting. I actually felt it. All right. So the place to end here is just to tell you how my patient did. If you remember, this gentleman came in. He was very anxious. He actually met all the criteria for panic disorder, all the criteria for generalized anxiety disorder. First thing I had him do was I gave him our Unwinning Anxiety app and had him head out and start mapping out his habit loops. He came back 2 weeks later and he sat down. He was excited to tell me something. And he said, "Doc, I lost 14 pounds. And I said, "What?" He was, because of his obesity, we were planning to touch on that, but we were really going to focus on his anxiety first. And he said, I was mapping out these anxiety habit loops, and I realized that anxiety was triggering stress eating, and that stress eating was resulting in me feeling bad about myself because I knew that I was at a very unhealthy weight. So I stopped doing it. Over the course of 6 months or so, he went on to lose about 100 pounds through simply paying attention to these habit loops. And, finding that bigger, better offer of not overeating, of not stress eating, and really, his hypertension went away, his fatty liver resolved, his obstructive sleep apnea got much better. But how do you do with his anxiety? Well, I was walking out of class one day at the School of Public Health. And for any of you that have been to Providence, the School of Public Health is on Main Street, South Main Street in Providence. And I was walking out of class on the sidewalk, and this car pulls up. This guy rolls down his window, and it's my patient. And I looked at him quizzically, because he'd come to me because he could barely drive on the street. And he gives me this big smile, and he says, "I'm an Uber driver now. I'm on my way to the airport." So what this suggests is that as we learn how our minds work, we can bring awareness in and have that awareness really help us tap into our own wisdom, where we can step out of these habit loops and really into a new way of being. I will stop there, and I love this quote from Mary Oliver, who is this poet that died, I think, in 2019, where she says, she sums it all up very nicely. Pay attention, be astonished, and then, of course, tell about it. So I will stop there, and happy to take any questions about what I just talked about, or also just questions about how to work with anxiety in these very uncertain times. So perhaps we could even start, if folks have questions, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, I have a question. I was just wondering, you mentioned in one of the videos about how technology can negatively impact anxiety. And so I just wondered if you have any suggestions of good habits we can try to build in this world where we are on Zoom all day, every day, and just in front of a screen all the time.
Like right now. Yes, that's a really good question. So here, I think we can explore, what are the things that we are doing that are negatively impacting our health in areas where we naturally have to be, for example, we have to be on Zoom. My clinic is now virtual, and so I'm on screen quite a bit with my patients. So we can look to see, are there times, for example, when we're on a Zoom meeting and we're getting, maybe we have a bunch of technology set up where, our emails ping when we get new emails, or our phone goes off when we get texts, or we've got our social media accounts set up so that when we get new alerts, those go off. Those things can be really, can be anxiety provoking themselves, because this dream that's really a fallacy of multitasking is really, is really harmful for our brains, and actually makes us more anxious because we can't really pay attention to a bunch of things at once. So here we can look to see, what habits are we setting up ourselves where we might actually be contributing to our, to worsening mental health, simply through things that we think are supposed to be set up to help us optimize or at least be efficient in our lives. So that's one thing that we can do. Another thing is finding ways where we can not just be completely sedentary when we're on a Zoom meeting. So finding a way to stand up while we're in a meeting, propping our computers up on books, or having a standing desk if that's possible, where we can be standing. Or some folks have the benefit of being able to have a treadmill, where they can be walking where they're on Zoom meetings. So there are ways that we can incorporate, both our minds and bodies, where we're, physically taking care of ourselves in ways that are healthy, as compared to just, being completely sedentary in a chair. Even standing up, a couple of times an hour is really helpful. So I don't know if that gives you a couple of things to play with or gets at your question.
Yeah, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I would say play with it, explore. There are lots of ways that we can play with these things.
Yeah, I had a very quick question. Sort of like speaking from personal experience, sometimes it's really difficult to identify like when you're stressed or like when you're anxious. So my question is, do you have any advice for like, I guess ways to like identify that a lot quicker?
That is a really good question. I hadn't realized the nuanced differences between stress and anxiety until I really explored this a lot personally and was working with a lot of patients around this. And in fact, there's a lot of overlap in terms of the emotional quality and the physical sensations, but there are some distinct differences. For example, with stress, it tends to have some specific precipitant or a trigger. Whereas anxiety, a lot of my patients wake up in the morning and they just say, I wake up and I'm anxious. So there's no specific trigger for that. Yet the physical sensations when somebody's stressed or when they're anxious can have a lot of overlap. So even what I find helpful is just being able to map out, what are there specific, behavioral patterns or even habit loops around one versus the other. So for example, with stress, it could be the to-do list, that endless to-do list that then gets alleviated a little bit by, checking that to-do list off. With anxiety, it's hard to identify a trigger, and that anxiety can actually feed worry, and we can recognize worry and start to work with stepping out of those habit loops themselves. I put together a short course on the difference between stress and anxiety. That's actually freely available on an app called Breathe. I think it's Breathe by ShareCare or something like that. That actually has 5 or 10 sessions that walks people through, all these things and the differences between those two. So if you want to learn more, you can download that app, and it gives a short tutorial on those things if you want to geek out about that a little bit more.
I have a question. So, I feel maybe this is something I do, maybe it's something other people do, but I feel like sometimes when I have something stressful to do, like on my list, instead of doing what I think would be the normal thing, which would just be getting it done, I just kind of procrastinate and wait it out and, put it off, and that just makes it more stressful. I was wondering if you because now explaining the habit loop, that seems to make a lot of sense why I do that. Putting it off as kind of that temporary relief. I was wondering, what you think and like any particular tips to kind of get out of those habits, those loops.
Yeah, and are you talking about procrastination specifically?
Yeah, procrastination specifically, I guess, definitely as finals are coming up.
Yeah. So I use a 3-step process with my patients. So the first one is mapping out the habit loop, and it seems like you're already in that first step, right? The second step is tapping into that reward center in our brain. So our brain is going to keep doing something if it sees it as rewarding. So I have folks ask the simple question, what am I getting from this? Okay. So not to put you on the spot, but if you were to think about the last time you procrastinated, what did you get from the procrastination?
I guess just putting off the difficult feeling of doing the task.
Mm-hmm. So maybe some temporary or brief relief that comes from, not doing it. So what does it feel like when you're actually engaged in like rolling with a task? How does that feel?
I guess usually I find that the hardest part is just starting it.
Yeah. But once you're rolling, how does that feel?
Not as bad.
Yeah. So here, I think you're pointing out something really important. So if for anybody that remembers back to their chemistry days, there's this activation energy, that you need to overcome to get into, for a chemical bond to form. This is where catalysts and things like that come in. And so here you're highlighting something really important, which is 2 things, I guess. One is it actually feels pretty good when we're doing a task, some folks might be familiar with this concept of flow, especially athletes, right? This is like the optimal performance state where we're just completely immersed in what we're doing. So that actually feels really good. And one thing we can do is reflect back on the last time we were really immersed in a project or doing something and how good that feels. And that helps our brain see that, oh, this is this bigger, better offer. When I'm working on this project, it actually feels pretty good. And that in itself can help provide that activation energy to get over that hump of, I don't want to do this. This doesn't feel good. Where it kind of provides that catalyst to get over that and just get started with the project. And then once we're immersed in the project, we're doing it. It feels good. The other thing that we can do to keep that energy going is to turn off all distractions, shutting off our email, shutting off any alerts that we get from our phones and this and that, so that we can really stay focused and engaged. Because our brains actually take a lot of energy. So our brains are not parallel processors, they're serial processors. So they'll do one thing and then another thing. So when we're trying to multitask, we actually have to jettison basically the working memory, everything that we have in working memory from one thing, and then upload from another. And then, when we switch back, we're switching those around. So that's tremendously taxing on our brain. It doesn't help us get either project done or multiple ones. And it's also really draining. So the more we can turn all of those other things off, the more it helps us actually get into the zone as we're doing a project. So that's actually step 2 and 3, where you reflect on, what's it like to procrastinate, as you described, not so good. And then what's it like to be in a task? I think, as you said, not as bad, and I would suggest when we're really ripping with a task, it feels pretty good. So that's something that anybody can play with, as you go into finals, or anytime that there's this procrastination that comes up. Even for a moment, when you feel that, I don't want to do this, take a moment to get curious about what that feels like. Where's that in my body? Is it more on the right side or the left side of my body? And just get really curious about it. Doesn't matter where it is, but that curiosity of, where do I feel this the most, can also provide that catalytic energy to get us over the hump and into the doing of the project. So does that give you something to play with?
Definitely. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. Thanks for the question. I'm sure a lot of folks could benefit from that one.
Hi, Dr. Judd. I've got two questions that folks sent me directly. The first one is, what types of meditation activities would you recommend for people to help strengthen their mind daily?
What types of meditation activities would I recommend for people to practice to strengthen their minds daily? I would say anything that works for you. So for example, I started practicing, breath awareness meditation. I did that for 10 years. I flailed at that. That was really hard. So I'd say find whatever is straightforward and easy for you to do. There's one, if somebody's very stressed out, for example, there's a great practice, and I actually have a short YouTube tutorial on this called 5-finger breathing, where you basically take one hand, take the index finger to the other, and as you breathe in, you trace up, your pinky. As you breathe out, you trace down. And basically, as you take 5 breaths, you're tracing the inside and the outside of your fingers. You can do 10 breaths, go back from your thumb to your pinky. What this does is it takes up all the working memory in the part of our brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where if we're all anxious and worried, it doesn't have space to worry and pay attention to feeling, this finger and this finger at the same time, to looking at our hands and to feeling our breath at the same time. That takes a lot of brain space. You can think of it's like fills up all the RAM on our brain's computer. And then we calm down because we're taking 5 mindful breaths. Then when those worry thoughts come back in, there's a mismatch in the emotional intensity where we're calm. Those thoughts come in and say, hey, you should be anxious. And they're much easier just to notice, oh, there's a thought, and let it go rather than getting caught up in it. So there's a practice that somebody can do in the moment when they're anxious or stressed. But as a daily practice, I like having what I call, these short moments many times. So just taking a moment, to look out the window and, get really curious about nature, for example. It's a really great way to bring a short mindfulness practice in. Oh, what do the colors really look like on that tree? Or what's the texture of that bark? What are the colors in the leaves, as they're changing, all those types of things. So those are very short mindfulness practices that we can do, 30 seconds, a minute. We can do simple practices where we just stand up and feel what our body feels like, changing posture. So finding something that we're going to do normally, like walking to the bathroom, we can get really curious. Oh, what does it feel like as my body walks? Those types of things are really good places to start. If somebody wants to go a little bit farther, there are tons of guided meditations, breath awareness, loving kindness practice if folks are struggling with self-judgment, things like that, where you can find all sorts of tutorials on the internet. I've got a couple on my YouTube channel, but there are tons of resources there. So the bottom line there, I would say, is find what works for you as a place to start, and then build from there. And certainly in the Breathe app that I mentioned earlier, we've got a bunch of guided meditations. It's all free. Folks can download that if they want to play with some of those things. And we even have these short check-ins that are built into the app where people can check in throughout the day and do some short mindfulness practices.
Thank you for that. This other question that someone sent me is, could you please, if you could share methods or advice to mitigate anxiety when you have no choice but to go through an anxiety-inducing task. I'm speaking specifically in reference to testing anxiety, which is something I and a few other students I know struggle a bit with. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So test anxiety itself. So here, I think practicing some of these practices as we go throughout the day before, way before our tests, is a really great way to go. I think of it as training for any endurance race. You don't say, hey, I'm going to run a marathon tomorrow, and you sign up for one and you go run it. You train for it. And so you start out slow, and then, you build up your mileage and all of that. And I think the same is true for test anxiety. So knowing that tests are coming, months or weeks down the road, we can start doing some of these short practices throughout the day, so we build up our mental muscles. So for example, that whenever we notice that we're starting to get a little stressed, even just thinking about a test, we could do that 5-finger breathing practice that I just mentioned, or we could even just take a couple of short mindful breaths, or we could even just get curious about, oh, where does that stress feel, where do I feel that stress most in my body? Is it on the right side or the left side, or front or back, or, we can explore what that feels like. So the more we can build up our mental muscles around, short moments when we're noticing we're stressed or anxious, we can then start even purposefully training where we think about the test. Oh, I have a test coming up in a couple of weeks, and see if that in itself brings on a little bit of test anxiety. Bring in a specific practice right then, so that as we get closer and closer to the date, we can bring those practices in. We can work with the anxiety in those moments. And then when it comes time for the test, we can go into the test as prepared as we can be mentally. And hopefully that helps keep our thinking brain online so we can take the test. And then anytime that we notice that we're starting to get stressed, we can take a couple of breaths, which are going to be much more efficient than just ignoring it, calm ourselves down, and then continue with the test. So that's something, certainly, I think of it as training for the test from a mental perspective.
I had a question. So with respect to, I think, something you touched on in the beginning was that you really found joy in being outdoors, and that was something very restorative to you. And I think a lot of us here could probably identify with that. But sometimes that is incongruent with, academia or a career in academia in general, or, this idea of being productive and getting work done. So how do you find balance in your career now to get outside and do those things that make you feel good while still, managing a successful lab and practice?
Yeah, it's a great question. So here, this took a lot of me falling on my face to learn this. So hopefully if this is me falling on my face is helpful for anybody else. Not falling on there is great. So here, I think it just takes us really seeing what the results are of not getting outside versus what they are of getting outside. So, we can even map this out from a habitual perspective where, I've got a bunch of work to do. So there's the trigger, and then my behavior might be, I'm just going to buckle down. I'm going to sit at my desk. I'm not going to do anything else until I, clear out my inbox and write this paper and, meet with my graduate student or whatever. And then I can look at those results and ask, okay, how well did those tasks get done during the day? And I can look at that on a daily basis, and I can also look at it on a weekly and a monthly basis to check to see, how burnt out am I, or how well am I actually able to think or be creative. Then so there's mapping out that habit around, being productive. And then I can ask myself, what do I get from this? Importantly, I need to compare that. I need a comparison group. I need to do that, that study of that N of 1 study where I compare myself of doing that versus compare myself to getting outside. So when I get outside and I exercise, and take a half an hour, to go for a run, or take, I'm fortunate enough now to be able to go surfing. So take a couple of hours to just take the morning and go surf when the surf is good in Rhode Island. I can compare what that's like, what my productivity is like after taking those couple of hours, and compare that to what it was like to just put my head down. And I have to say, when I, this was before COVID, when I go, I'd surf for an hour and a half before going into work. My graduate students, my research assistants, they would know when I'd gone surfing, because I'm just in such, it's just such a better mood, can be much more creative. And actually, that 2 extra hours that I took to exercise was paid off in spades, because I was more creative. I was more focused. I was more connected with my lab. And so everything that got done the rest of the day was done in a much better manner than me just trying to force it and grind it out. And I think this is true, especially when we're trying to write something or be creative or solve a problem. We can't force those things to happen. Our brains are not actually great at just that grit, thinking through things. We really need to let our brains do that work, ironically or paradoxically, without us interfering. And the way to do that is to make sure that we're at optimal health where our brains can function optimally. So I find now that it's not even a decision for me anymore. I have to exercise, not because I must exercise because I know that exercise is good for me. But every day, I work for a few hours and then I know, my body's like, hey, look, I need a break. And I know from experience that break is going to be the most efficient way for me to work the rest of the day, but also maintain my mental health, maintain my relationships, with my wife and my colleagues. That it's just literally, it's a no-brainer for me. But that really took me, seeing what it was like to try A versus B and seeing that the just, grunt through it where I think if I just spend more time, I'm going to be more efficient, doesn't work. And where I actually spend less time, that less time is made up in spades with the efficiency that I get from optimal functioning. So, it really comes down to trying the experiment ourselves, but importantly, going in aware, knowing what we're studying, what we're testing, A versus B, as compared to just randomly correlating things, which tends not to work so well.
Hi, Dr. Brewer. I have a question. So some of the techniques you brought up involve asking yourself how you feel after something happens, or after you, or more broadly, after you go through an experience. And I get. So my question is, some of this retrospection happens a long time after the reward of that experience, be it a negative reward or a positive reward, have been kind of like delivered and have a chance to shape your behavior at that moment. So the question really comes down to, like, because the moment of reflection and the moment when your reward system got the chance to get that learning signal are so far apart in time, how is it that these moments of reflection can drive behavioral change? Is it? Yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there are two ways that we can explore this. One is the closer to the time, the closer to the behavior that we can reflect on the results, the more accurate the data are for our brain. So think of it as, if we do a behavior and we look immediately afterwards, we can really clearly see that cause and effect relationship. What were the results of that behavior? But if we don't have the opportunity to reflect on it for some reason right afterwards, or we didn't even notice that we were caught up in the behavior and then we just went right on to something else, what we can do is look at it afterwards and recreate the situation in our mind, where we can imagine what that behavior was like. So for example, we have we have this eating app that helps people with stress and emotional eating called Eat Right Now. And what we do is we embed this tool in it called this craving tool. We have people imagine eating like overeating or stress eating or eating junk food. And we have them imagine going through the process itself, because what that does is it draws on the previous behavior, because we can only imagine things based on our previous behavior. That's that's how our brains kind of do these simulations, is based on what happened to us before. And as we imagine going through that, or even just imagining what it was like the last time we did something, we can start to bring up the emotional quality, the physical sensations, and even the thoughts that run through our heads, simply through that exercise of imagining it or just remembering the last time we did it. And as long as we can bring up the direct physical sensations and the emotional qualities that happened the last time, we can still learn from them, because that represents the reward value. And so we can really look to see, what am I getting from this as I even imagine doing this? For example, if anybody, I'll just use a concrete example. If we think of a food that we don't like to eat, and we imagine eating that food, we can probably bring up the quality of that yuck that comes from that. Or if we ate a certain type of food and we had food poisoning, that's actually a really strong learning mechanism where, we can really recall what that was like, to the point where anytime we think about that type of food, it automatically brings up that yuck sensation, which was more of a protective mechanism. So here, if we can recall those situations to the point where it brings up those thoughts, those emotions, those body sensations, that means it's still we can still learn from it, even retrospectively. And the more we can do that, the more it helps us really see very clearly what the reward value is. And then, if it's not as rewarding as we remembered, that reward value drops. And then that helps us change the behavior. Does that get at your question?
Yes, but just a quick follow-up. I think one of the main problems, though, with some of these the kinds of behaviors that one might want to change is that the immediate reward is a lot stronger. And say with eating junk food, you get this immediate, really, I feel amazing, and then it's then this very prolonged, oh, I feel like I don't feel as good anymore. But I feel amazing happens really close and really powerfully to the eating act, whereas oh, I don't feel so great happens many hours after, and maybe while you're doing some other thing. And so it's difficult to see how how you can bind as forcefully this negative affect to the act as in comparison to the positive reward that you got when doing the act itself.
Yeah. So I'm glad you bring that up, because you're bringing up some of the nuance here, which is we can associate a lot of things, you're saying it's amazing with eating, you say, junk food. Now, there's this composite reward value that builds up, let's say cake, for example, where we've learned to associate cake every time we went to a birthday party, when we were young, we associate cake with friends and parties and ice cream and all this. And that reward value actually gets set down in our brain. It's only when we actually truly pay attention to eating that item of food now that it helps us see very, very clearly just how rewarding it is. So that amazing feeling, for example, for me, I explored this with eating gummy worms. So gummy worms were that amazing thing. I couldn't actually have a bag of gummy worms in my house. I would have to eat the whole thing because I just couldn't stop eating it. So I thought gummy worms were amazing until I started really paying attention. And I started realizing, when I really paid attention to each bite, a couple of things. One is that they didn't actually taste that good. They were kind of this slimy, a little too sweet, almost like this petroleum feel to them. So it wasn't as great as I thought. And also that when I ate one, it just drove me to eat another one. I would have this craving to eat more, and that craving feeling wasn't that great either. So I then started comparing that to eating blueberries. And I realized that blueberries actually tasted great. They were just as sweet. The sweetness was actually at a perfect titration, let's say, because nature knows how to give us just the right amount of sweetness. And also, I wasn't craving more blueberries. The other thing I noticed, and I think you were pointing this out, was that afterwards, I wouldn't get this sugar rush and crash, or I wouldn't feel bad later, and I wouldn't feel guilty about eating a whole bag of gummy worms, because the blueberries, I'd kind of eat enough, and then I'd get full, and I would just I wouldn't gorge myself on pints and pints of blueberries. I would eat some, and then I would naturally stop eating them. So the other thing here is to really pay attention, bite by bite. And I like to have folks ask this simple question: how little is enough? It doesn't mean that junk food, we should stop eating junk food, or we're never going to eat junk food again. But we can simply ask ourselves, how little is enough? Like, is this bite still as good as the last bite? Is this bite still as good as the last bite? And we can see, where that joy of eating kind of plateaus and then starts to tail off as we're, as our basically the that dopamine hit in our brain saturates. The other thing we can do is compare that to eating something healthy as a treat, and see which one gives us longer lasting satisfaction. And certainly for myself, and this is something for all of us to discover, is, I've never had somebody find that they actually eat more junk food when they pay attention than when they really pay attention, they'll either plateau or they'll start eating less of it, especially when they find something that's naturally rewarding that doesn't have all the negative effects down the road. So something to explore and discover for yourself, see what happens, see if you do end up eating more, or how amazing that amazing really is when you're paying attention to each bite. So lots to explore and discover there, but thanks for the question. I think we're probably getting to the end of time, Rick. Should we do, I can take one more question, or we could call it at that. Happy to do whatever would be helpful.
Yeah, it's all good for what's good for you, Judd.
Why don't we take maybe one more, if there is one more, and then we can wrap it up.
I have one that was sent to me in the chat. That's all right. How do you go from the calm slash adrenaline of a rewarding activity to the one that you need to do, which brings up the anxiety again?
That's a very good question, and probably a good one to end on. So here, I would say what we can start to explore is the journey. So we can think of what is it that actually makes something seem difficult. And often it's I have to get this done by a deadline, or this is going to be a lot of work, or whatever. It's often the destination that we're focusing on. We're focusing on what needs to get checked off. And that's what we're looking at as, that doesn't feel very good. Here, what I would suggest is that we can bring awareness to the journey itself and take it one moment at a time and ask ourselves, what's it like just to take this step forward? What's it like just to take this step forward? And see if we can bring that curiosity in as a kind of as a catalyst or a Kickstarter to help us start taking those steps. So we're doing this enjoyable activity, and certainly the enjoyable activities can be really helpful. Maybe we're going for a walk to kind of take a break, and we know that we have to start this project afterwards. We can look to see, am I leaning into the future? Am I starting to worry, like, oh no, this is going to be terrible? And can we look at those thoughts and get curious? Oh, there's a thought. There's this thought that's pulling me into the future. Can we get curious about those and bring awareness in and watch those thoughts come up? So you can think of thoughts as, I'm just using my fist here. We kind of glom onto these thoughts like, oh no, and we either push them away or they take us for a ride. We can bring awareness in right in these moments and go, oh, instead of, oh no, oh, there's the thought. And see if those thoughts can kind of come and go on their own, rather than us struggling with them or getting caught up in them. And that's often the case that drives, that makes us think of, oh, here's this pleasant activity and here's this very unpleasant activity. As we start to bring awareness in more and more moment to moment, it helps us see that we're actually making these unpleasant activities unpleasant because we're thinking about them in the future. It's when we actually get into them that they're not as bad as we thought. And if we take that journey approach moment by moment, we can actually start to literally enjoy the ride as we're doing it, rather than worrying about the destination and thinking about how bad that is. Now, that might sound a little easier said than done, but it's certainly worth exploring compared to being caught up in the alternative, because we can't just spend our entire lives, quote unquote, doing pleasant things. What we can do is we can make our entire life that journey and realize that our entire life, no matter what we're doing, can actually be pleasant in itself, or at least not as bad as we often make it out to be. So maybe something for all of us to explore. Can we enjoy the ride, no matter what that is?
or anything you want to say, Judd, just about sort of where people can find the apps?
Probably my website is the easiest place, drdjud.com. It links to all 3 of our apps, one for smoking, one for eating, one for anxiety, and then also that Breathe app that I mentioned. But you can also just search them on the App Store, the Google Play Store. But my website's probably the easiest way to find those. If you're struggling with any anxiety related to coronavirus, I put out a bunch of short YouTube videos. So that's just on YouTube under Dr. Judd. But probably the website, drjudd.com is the best place to look. We also have a bunch of just free resources like videos and animations that explain a lot of this stuff if you want to explore it a little bit more.
Judd, just thank you so much from all of us at Princeton for sharing a bunch of all your great knowledge and experience. I know you've been thinking about this hard, for such a long time, and you've made so many, really insightful breakthroughs because you've been so intentional about it. So thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Always happy to help my alma mater. So thanks, Rick.